Ron, I'm at Exhibit 605, and I'm going to page 6. And this deals, again, Mr. Commissioner, with the question of safe passage through the Fraser River once fish are passed through the public commercial fleet. And two issues that arise that the Standing Committee dealt with in 2004 was the question of dropouts in gill nets, specifically set nets, and the blockage effect. And if we go to page 6 of the report, right at the very bottom, the Standing Committee is referring to Dr. Pierce's 1992 report, and the quote there, catches in the lower Fraser and up through the canyon probably exceeded estimates by 200,000 fish. Significant losses can also be attributed to fishing-induced mortality, dead fish dropping out of nets, and fish dying of stress after escaping from the nets. So this is not anything particularly new. It's been a problem for a long time, and there's been numerous efforts to address it. And of course, the Standing Committee here is raising it again. And if we go to page 32 of the same report, please, Mr. Lund, at the bottom paragraph again, page 32. And this is the Standing Committee summing up the evidence of one of the people who testified before the Standing Committee once. And they said another significant factor, and I don't need to read that to you, Mr. Commissioner, and it continues in the next page, and Mr. Gould, who is referred to here, shows that because of the dropout phenomenon, a set net left unattended in the water for 24 hours will land only 1/6 of what would have been landed if the net had been checked every 2 hours. Mr. Gould assumed the remaining 5/6 of the catch dies, falls from the net, is swept downstream and unaccounted for. Mr. Gould argued that set nets are extremely destructive, and their use was a major contributing factor to the missing fish in 2004. Now, we don't know how often set nets in the Fraser Canyon are picked. Certainly, probably with the commercial fishery, they're picked more often than the food fishery, but they're often left overnight. There's 500 of those nets in the Fraser Canyon in a heavy commercial fishery, maybe more. This is a very intense, biggest commercial fishery on Fraser Sockeye and the coast right now in terms of fishing effort. So even if Mr. Gould is wrong and it's maybe 1 out of 10 fish drop out of the nets, we're still looking in an average year at very large numbers of fish that this could be accounting for some of the difference between estimates. And what's peculiar is we're now, Pierce was 2002, he wrote about it. The Standing Committee wrote about it in 2004. Exhibit 1738, which I'm not going to bring you to, Mr. Commissioner, describes a memo from written, and it was a request of PSARC, the Science Salmon Subcommittee for DFO, recommending a study on this, and the advice was ignored again. So a big serious issue, and I think it's revealing for the Commission to say, why wasn't this studied? Certainly if the seine fleet or the troll fleet or the public coastal commercial fleet had that type of mortality rate arising, there would have been intensive studies and serious steps taken to deal with it. So that's the dropout rate. The second factor is at the bottom of page 33. I think you're there, Mr. Lunn, already. And carries on onto the next page. I'm sorry, the next page, Mr. Lunn, page 75, a long way from the next page. Page 75. And the Standing Committee again refers to the dramatic impact of set nets in the Fraser Canyon. And they talk about, at the inset, the impact of set nets pushing salmon from the back eddies, where they rest in strong current, because there's now nets in the back eddies. They're pushing them into the center of the river. Of course, the current is strong, they have to work harder, and then when they do go into the back eddy to rest, they're often caught in a gill net. And this was especially noticeable in the next paragraph after the quotation, and they're talking about 2004, and they talk the variation in daily estimates of fish passing Hell's Gate in 2004 highlights the blockage effect of the set net fishery. In 2004, the intensive aboriginal fishery between Mission and Sawmill Creek was closed on August 15th. In the next 4 days, 80,200 sockeye were recorded going by the counter at Hell's Gate. In the previous 10 days, only 52,800 sockeye were recorded passing Hell's Gate, or 5,200 a day. So we've gone from 5,200 a day to 20,000. Now, if that's a one-day fishery, not really that big an issue, because the intention of fishing, of course, catch and fish. But if the fishery is going on 2 days and 3 days and 4 days, you can imagine the impact, especially in warm water, of the blockage effect on fish that aren't even necessarily being caught, but are held fighting in the center of the current, held in back eddies, approaching the net, drifting back. And again, the standing committee, in their report, they recommended these issues be studied. And if I read your report correctly, your interim report, these issues were not looked at, not studied. And I think it's really informative for the commission to ask, why weren't they studied? Mr. Rosenblum raised the question of selective fishing. I'm sorry, Mr. Lund, Exhibit 607. This is a fishery proposal to DFO submitted by the organization that I represent and the fishermen that I represent. And it just deals with the question of selective fishing and why it was, at page 11, Mr. Lund, why it got quite controversial. And you saw a pushback on the part of the fleet to selective fishing proposals. If we jump down to the next page, story, stay right there, yeah. And it talks about in 2001, some selective projects were the subject of intense criticism and controversy. And then the next bullets list some of the problems. A small number of people were benefiting. Certain projects gained approval because there was a belief that the personal relationships between the participants and DFO officials were interfering. Certain projects provided data of questionable value. So Area E said, and if we go down to the next bit, from now on, let's do them all through Area E. Let's make sure everybody in the fleet benefits, at least from the research. Make sure that they're targeted at actually providing fishing opportunities for the fleet, rather than a couple people who everybody thought were friends of DFO. I'm not suggesting that was the case, but that was the view on the dock. So it's not a case that the commercial fishing fleet, public fleet, didn't support selective fishing. They just wanted a fair process where the opportunities were fair. And I think you saw some of that same complaint reflected in the submission of the same fleet, Area B. And I'm going to jump quickly to the Fisheries Act without going anywhere. I've seen the province has suggested a new Fisheries Act be passed, and we'd certainly like to bring your attention to the controversy with that, Mr. Commissioner. And it's a very big, serious issue, and we hope that that wouldn't be a recommendation. We certainly don't support it. If I could go to, in my reply submission, Mr. Lund, we can go to page 31. And you'll see at paragraph 87, I've done fairly bad math there, Mr. Commissioner. And the last column in that table there, the figures should be $3,080, $1,600.70, sorry, $1,670 and $180, rather than the low numbers you see there. It doesn't stop the point that we're trying to make, that upriver commercial fisheries, even if you reallocated all the fish only to Aboriginal groups, when you divide it by the amount of people there are, there's simply not enough fish to build sustainable fisheries. And there was a lot of discussion on terminal fisheries, and they're not a management panacea. They can often cause as many problems as they solve, especially if they led to larger than necessary escapes of spawners, as we've seen. For example, if a run of 3 million is harvested in terminal areas instead of the marine fishery, there may be overcrowding in the migratory routes, larger numbers. It'd be like trying to pack 1 million cars through the Dease Island Tunnel. We're actually better off to harvest those fish on the coast, because we're never going to harvest all of them, because the migratory routes are broad, and so a lot of fish will not simply run into a net. If we try and harvest these fish in terminal areas, especially if we go into terminal areas like Shuswap Lake or the Stewart and Tackle Lakes, you're harvesting fish that have already survived that arduous journey up the Fraser River. And if there's anything to genetic selection, the toughest fish are getting up there, the weakest fish are dying. So we're actually now targeting the fish that are most genetically predisposed to make it up to the top of the Fraser, to the spawning grounds. We just don't think, in summing up our submission on terminal fisheries, and we dealt with it quite a bit, is that there simply hasn't been enough research done. DFO can't tell you, where am I going to put a terminal fishery, for example, to not harvest driftwood, early Stuart sockeye run. They can't tell you where to put the terminal fishery to not harvest the bull run, but harvest other stocks. So, you know, a fair recommendation is that it be steady properly. And if terminal fisheries are the only way to solve some problems, then maybe a terminal fishery is appropriate. But if that happens, and if we come to that day, then every terminal fishery has to be open for every Canadian. The idea that we're going to reserve terminal fisheries for certain groups is unacceptable in Canada in 2011. And by opening it to every group, we take one big part of the equation out of it. Is, are we trying to create economic benefits for a certain group, or are we trying to deal with the conservation problem? Thanks, John. And that will clearly make the focus, okay, it's obviously not to deliver economic benefits because it's open for everybody. That means we'll open it to every Canadian, so it's not favoritism for one group, it's actually going to deal with the conservation problem if that's the only way. So we certainly say, if a terminal fishery is the only way, if fishing in non-tidal waters is the only way, then it must be open for all Canadians. Could I pull up Exhibit 75, please, Mr. Lunn, and go to page 301? I've relied on this exhibit considerably in our written and oral submissions because it's the people who manage that were successful. These men and women took over the Fraser fishery in 1946. They had no computers, they had no models, they had no photocopiers, they had no cell phones, and yet they built the fishery from extremely low levels. And I know you've heard the horsefly story. 841 spawners in 1941, 9 million spawners in 1993. A fantastic and magnificent rebuilding. And I bring your attention to this section because it's the reasons for the IPFSC success. And I think these reasons are really important. And if I could go to page 303, Mr. Lunn. And at the almost the first sentence in the left-hand column, and it was clear that the parties' intentions, so Canada and the US, were that the Commission would have authority to preserve, protect, and extend the resource. No indication that it would be a responsibility shared with any other entity in any respect. Necessary biological and engineering investigations were the Commission's responsibility. The sole authority of the Commission in regard to management of the fisheries was clearly identified. We say that this is the model. We've heard all kinds of policy documents, all kinds of consultations and strategies and roadmaps and processes, all in the past 20 years with a record of failure. This is the model that rebuilt the fishery from far, far lower levels in the department, and we say that this is the proper model. And the last paragraph on this page, the Commission's ability to get the job done was primarily related to the simplicity of its mandate and the efficient manner in which it was permitted to implement the decision-making process. And to us, those are keys. And I'll bring you to one last point, page 310, Mr. Lunn. And there's this, that particular insert there, non-political control. And I think that's as important as anything that I've ever said before this Commissioner, as any witness has said. And the Commission from 1937 to the early 1970s focused on the needs of the resource. Additional problems also arose during these years. However, the Commission enjoyed a free rein to pursue these without undue interference from the governments or the fishing industries. I'm part of the fishing industry, and my fellow fishermen are, but we recognize that there has to be one manager with a narrow, efficient mandate targeted at managing the fishery. Department of Fisheries is not in the business of building capacity in Aboriginal groups. It's not in the business of seeing how many fish we need to support bears in Adams Lake. It's not in the business of aquaculture promotion. It's a narrow mandate. It's a mandate to protect and encourage the fishery. And right now the department is spread all over the place, doing a terrible job of everything. We think there's excellent people inside the department who, given the proper mandate and the proper tools, could rebuild the fishery in the same way the IPFSC did. And we don't see it happening in the environment. We don't see it happening in the wild salmon policy. I note in my submission where I quoted Mr. Sprout referring, sure, we have an objective, and he talked about the little house in the wild salmon policy, and we have 17 strategies and 6 principles under the strategies. In another document in the commission evidence, there's 47 different policies and priorities the department has. It's simply too broad. Management authority is spread all over. And I have about 10 minutes, so I'd like to go to no, I'm sorry, Mr. Lunn, I've missed my exhibit number, but if you could find it for me by, it's the Comprehensive Fisheries Agreement for sockeye, pink and chum salmon. Thank you. And I bring this up because we're very concerned about balkanization of Fishery Management Authority. And you've seen a number of proposals where DFO is getting into discussions through PICFI, through other discussions, the Northern Planning process, administration of parks, where a variety of groups will decide what goes on in the fishery in a certain area. We think that's entirely the wrong approach. As much as we object to the management of the past 20 years, still has to be one manager. And an example of this is in the document Mr. Lund was kind enough to find for me, and it's a comprehensive fisheries agreement with a number of stolo groups on the Fraser River. And if we look at the index on the next page, Mr. Lund, you can see the variety of issues being discussed there and the variety of subjects, and it continues on into the next page. And I'm just going to bring through a couple of those issues in the document. If we go to page 8, please, Mr. Lund.
What exhibit number is it?
Exhibit 1250.
Exhibit 1250. Thank you, Mr. Lund. So this is an issue resolution process between the STOLO and the Department of Fisheries. And if you read down, there's a number of steps. Now, this isn't just the food fishery, this is also commercial fishing. Of course, there's no process like this in the fishery that I work in. But if there's a dispute and the parties can't resolve it, the supervisors are involved. And then at 15E, we see they can refer the matter with written details to the Regional Director General. And at any point, they can have a facilitator. And after the fishing season, they go back through the issues. Now, this is the agreement with the STOL. Multiply that with the agreements for potentially 97 bands in the Fraser River, or the 147 bands that access Fraser River sockeye. So when I go through this, you can keep that in context. If we go to page 15, Mr. Lund. In clause 2A, in the fishing plan, DFO agrees to manage Pacific Coast fisheries and other related fisheries with the goal of providing the bands with a reasonable opportunity to catch the quantities of salmon set out in Appendix 1 and Appendix 2. Now, clearly, that's a priority, a commercial priority for a user group that's not extended. They're saying, we'll shut down the coastal public commercial fishery to make sure that you have a reasonable chance to catch your fish. Again, different fisheries operating under different rules. Now, if we go to page 16, Mr. Lund, please. At 2J, and this is how fishing times are developed. Each week when fisheries are planned or otherwise required, the planning community will review the plan and provide the RDG with a recommendation. This is the Fraser Panel's job. By a treaty between the United States and Canada, the Fraser Panel is supposed to be managing commercial fisheries. Here we have a joint technical committee with a group, private group, setting and recommending to the RDG when they're going to fish. Process that exists outside of the Fraser Panel. And again, think of this process multiplied by the various groups up and down the river. Planning committee will be implemented by DFO and the bands in a cooperative manner, subject to the final decision-making authority of the minister. So the way I read this, if the planning committee comes up with an idea, there's DFO staff in there, and they say, let's do this, DFO must implement that. And the only way they cannot implement it is going to the minister. Now, sometimes we want to fish on a Monday, or sometimes we want to fish on a Wednesday. You can see the kind of difficulties this causes, especially if you have a whole number of groups. On page 18, Mr. Lund, there was quite a bit of discussion during the hearings on the definition of what social is in food, social, and ceremonial. For example, September 2nd, page 54, line 21, it was talked about. And that's food, social, ceremonial, of course, came out of Sparrow. And after 20 years, they still haven't defined what social is. Now here at 3B, for greater certainty, subsection 3A shall not be interpreted as precluding the traditional exchange or distribution of fish or fish products within and between Aboriginal people and Aboriginal communities. So DFO's added a fourth term in here, and I can't really define what traditional exchange or distribution of fish is. So rather than clarifying where we are in terms of what DFO is required to do under FSC fisheries, we've broadened it. And how does DFO now enforce if we're shipping herring spawn on kelp from Bella Coola to the Stolo, or if we're shipping Stolo fish to some Aboriginal group in Alberta? Almost an impossible enforcement problem. And at section 4A on the same page there, for management purposes, DFO will issue to the bands a communal commercial license. Now, in Como Seafoods, DFO litigated to the Supreme Court of Canada to preserve the minister's discretion. Of course, the minister signs this contract every year and commits to issue licenses. Now, we would call that an unlawful fettering of the minister's discretion, but you can see the types of problems that it does cause. If we go to page 25, Mr. Lund, section 9A. Again, we're talking about hails and estimations, and I asked a fair amount of questions about that in our cross-examination. And we don't have much faith in hail programs. We know they don't work in our fishery. They're not acceptable as a means to catch or record fish in any fishery. But here, they're still maintaining a hail program. And I know that Dr. Pierce talked about it in his 1992 report. It's long been a critical issue. And the last section I'd like to go to is page 28, Mr. Lund. And if we go to section 10F, it says here, the planning committee will determine the catches of salmon under the communal commercial license from sunrise the landing slip. And then 10G and 10H go on what happens in the event there's a dispute. And the planning committee, of course, is comprised of Aboriginal fishermen and DFO. So this planning committee determines what the catch is. And if there's a dispute, they can appeal to the RDG. That doesn't go on in the public commercial fishery, because number one, DFO has to have the flexibility to determine catches. As we've heard, there's recorded catches and sometimes there's leakage. In our fishery, DFO commonly adds a percentage to cover the leakage so that we have an accurate number that's reported. Here, the band can fight with DFO over what the catch is. I mean, clearly a delegation of DFO's management authority to another group at a most fundamental level. And at page 35, clause 3, Mr. Lund. In clause 3 at the very top, monitors will not fish in the fishery while on duty. Now, in my written submission, I noted the fishery general regulations about what it took to be an observer and the necessity not to have an interest in the fishery. And this is unacceptable for a monitor to have an interest in a fishery because it's a clear conflict of interest. It's these types of problems. And at page 36, there's a monitoring and enforcement protocol, and I won't go into it. But the overall effect of this agreement is that in the public commercial fishery, there's gillnet, troll, and seine. We're governed by regulations. The regulations are published. They go through the governor and council. We're also governed by license conditions. They apply to every single one of the fishermen using a specific gear type. In this type of agreement, everything is up for grabs every year. depending on how good the negotiators are, we may have one set of rules for one group and a different set of rules for another group, and multiply that by the chaos of 10 or 20 or 30 or 50 agreements. And it's one more path the DFO headed down. And I've heard suggestions, and I see it in some written submissions, that it's a requirement of Sparrow or co-management is a requirement, but clearly it's not. And I'm not an expert on the law, so I'll let other counsel address that. But what it does, it sets up a continuous fight between DFO and user groups. The people with these agreements will try and get up a leg up over the commercial fleet in their negotiations. One of the agreement signatories may try and get a leg up over another group, so continuously fighting over content of agreements, trying to seek advantage. We fought like crazy between Seine, Gillnet, and Troll fleets. But the difference was I could always join the Seine fleet or the Troll fleet or the Gillnet fleet. And it didn't matter if you thought the Seiners were getting the advantage, well, maybe you could switch. But at least the rules were transparent and public for everyone. See, Mr. Commissioner, I have about 2 minutes left, and I think I'll be done. And I want to bring you, and I don't have to bring you to it, but it's March the 4th, page 25. And it's a testimony of Mr. Sprout, a former RDG for DFO. And on cross-examination, I asked him, I said, what had changed in the management of the fishery that caused the chaos? Because the IPFC was doing such a wonderful job. What changed that led to the chaos? And on March the 4th, at page 22, line 25, he cited a number of things. He said we had the Sparrow decision, then we had climate change, and human population growth, and water withdrawal, and invasive species. Almost all of these changes happened all the time. We had climate change, we had pre-spawning mortality in the 70s in huge numbers in the horsefly run. Significantly, Mr. Sprout never acknowledged that there was a problem with DFO, never admitted a mistake, and I note Mr. Walters admitted, I was wrong about the overescapement issue. And I note in the IPFC, you'll see regularly, they say, we tried this, it didn't work, so we moved on to this. And admitting mistakes and admitting failure is an important part of getting better. The department is either they just simply refuse to admit mistakes because it would be a tough thing to do, or they don't think they've ever made a mistake. Yet we have a commission that's been appointed, a fishery in chaos. And if we look at the real changes that happened in 1992, we had DFO slowly assuming more and more management control from the Pacific Salmon Commission. We had the creation of a huge new commercial fishery. We had AFS agreements up and down the coast, as I explained, are complex and confusing. So a lot of the so-called complexities and uncertainties are DFO's creation. And if I had one message to the Commissioner, how to fix this fishery, it would be, let's get DFO out of all the other stuff, get him focused back on the simple mandate. And it may be that DFO is incapable, and we may have to go back to, and I would recommend actually going back to the IPFSC model, where the United States sort of kept Canada honest and Canada kept the United States honest. And the last subject that's really important to our members, and I'll be done in 30 seconds, Mr. Commissioner, thank you, is the question of what type of fishery should we have in the future. And I'm not going to go into the details because it's highly controversial. And in the decision of the Provincial Court, Regina and Cap, and the site is 2003 BCPC 0279, the learned Judge Kitchen went into detail about why this program that we complained about in the Upper River is wrong. And I think the testimony of the fishermen, the real impacts of people on the water, it encapsulates it there well. And Jack Groven, one of the fish processors, I think summed up the whole problem. Because it used to be happy fishery, everybody got along. The fights and controversy you've seen in this room didn't used to happen because we worked together. When a fisherman's boat was sinking, you'd go pull him off the beach, it didn't matter who he was. There was marriages and people were dating each other, and you went to funerals and christenings, and it was a true community. And Mr. Groven, he says, these different fisheries that are being granted to natives and stuff have caused hard feelings, and guys have got arguments and fights in the boat. And actually, in some cases, fist fights and stuff. And now the native votes are pretty well just native, and the white ones are all white, and it's lots of bickering. That's at paragraph 103. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Roger.
And thank you, Mr. Lund, for handling all the exhibits today.
Thank you very much.
The hearing is now adjourned until tomorrow at 10 a.m.